Right, hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our Chapter 5, Part 5 of Richard Hilton's Imperial Obituary, the Death of the British Empire. And tonight we are joined by Connor again. Hello, Connor, how are you?
Good. How are you doing, AI?
Not too bad, thank you. And we're also joined with a special guest and somebody who you've probably seen in chat and in the comments in um, previous episodes of this, and a friend of mine, IronDuke, of people know him from his Splendid Isolation streams on Saturday night uh, uh, um, or what would it be, Saturday morning, Sunday morning, Australian time.
Yeah, we do them at 9 p.m. on Saturdays UK time. At the moment,
Sorry to interrupt you, IronDuke, but you're
uh,
roboting. You're roboting at the moment.
I am. Okay, I'll go out and come back, mate. You know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Technical problems.
It's Australia problem.
Yes. How's that, IronDuke?
How's that going?
Oh, that's a lot better. That's better. Yeah. Sorry,
Is
you
it
were
better?
robot.
Cool.
Yeah, it was
I'm sorry.
roboting.
I'm sorry.
No worries. So yeah, Splendid Isolation at 9 p.m. UK time on your channel, and I'm on there every other week. Got Atom and Mitch, and we just talk about British and was it British and Commonwealth related subjects.
Usually, we had Morgoth as a guest last week. As you,
Yeah. Sorry, IronDuke. I hate to be a bugger with this, but you've started roboting again. It's really strange.
again. Okay. All right. Let's see what I can do.
You're actually that what you okay. Hold on. Hello, IronDuke.
How's that? Is that better?
That's okay. It was strange. As soon as you started your sentence, you didn't just started roboting in and out and in and out again. So sounded like there was a car going past as well. So anyway,
Okay.
yes, yes.
We'll play it by you.
As you mentioned, we had Morgoth on last week. I think that's probably one of the most popular in views related episode of Splendid Isolation, and that was a great discussion. So do go check it out. We all thoroughly enjoyed it. So guys, I think we'll get started with the fifth chapter. So this fifth chapter here is the struggle for India. So last chapter we talked about the American independence and the end of British rule in the 13 colonies. And I guess looking at back now, that was the sort of end of the British story and chapter in North America in any sort of meaningful or important way. I mean, of course, we would still hold on to Canada, and we still got to go to the 1812 conflict, but no doubt that'll be mentioned later on. But this is sort of Britain after losing the colonies and the sort of different direction the empire would take as a whole. Right. So if we're all ready, I think we'll get started. So chapter 5, the struggle for India. In the interest of in the interest of continuity, it has seemed So I do apologize, everyone. I'm going to have to zoom in because I haven't got my glasses with me. Hold on. There we go. I'm zooming in on the PDF. Okay, let me start again. The struggle for India. In the interest of continuity, it has seemed to the author advisable to carry the North American story through to the loss of the 13 colonies in 1783. It will now be necessary, therefore, to turn back to the launching of the East India Company on the last day of the 16th century. As already stated, during the first quarter century, the company's attention was concentrated far more intently on the so-called Spice Islands, Java and Sumatra, than on any part of the Asiatic mainland. But this did not mean that they entirely neglected the idea of starting trade with the Mughal Empire also. In 1607, Captain Hawkins, commanding the Hector, representing the East India Company, anchored in Surat on the mouth of the river Tapti uh, on the west coast of India. He found the Indian governor of Cambay, in which province Surat was situated, extremely hostile and objective, being entirely under the influence of Portuguese Jesuits. Hawkins, determined to appeal over the local governor's head directly to the emperor himself, and at length, after almost incredible adventures, he reached Agra and presented personally to the Mughal emperor the letters of credence entrusted to him by King James I. This took place on the 16th of April, 1609, and marks the first effective step in England's long connection with India. Queen Elizabeth had dispatched John Miltonhall some years earlier, but he had achieved nothing. Some accounts of this historic occasion is therefore worth recording as exemplifying the obstacles which the English company had to face. At Jenegier's court resided a Portuguese Jesuit who acted as his interpreter for European languages. King James' letters were handed to him to translate, and in doing so, the Jesuit so twisted the meaning as to give an unfavorable impression on the English king and nation. Fortunately, Hawkins quickly saw what was happening and himself addressed the emperor in the Turkish language. Jengier, delighted to meet a Westerner who could talk to him directly, engaged Hawkins in a long and friendly conversation, paying with little attention to the slow and stilted translation of the Jesuit. So, fellas, right off the bat there, what do we think? I think we just lost IronDuke, but hopefully he'll be back in 2 ticks.
It did. I mean, it's it points out that the Jesuits had sort of made a inroad or relationships with in India originally, and I think that's important to note. But also how the British were able to make thing or by being clever and by um, having sending the right people, they were able to um, make good relations.
No, and of course, we're going back to the what was it, the 17th century, right? And this also does play into, of course, the 1494 Treaty of Toledo, where effectively the New World, or the world itself, the New World, what would be divided up between Spain and Portugal. If you go on the map, you'll see what I mean. In that map, basically, the whole of Africa is considered laid claim to Portugal, along with the Indies, Spain, and that sort of bit of Portugal, what's now Mon Brazil, and then of course Spain had claim over the Americas and their territories there, and I guess with what we're seeing is the Jesuit in court there. This is the this is the sort of attempt to uphold that treaty. Of course, the Protestant nations, particularly like the Dutch and the English, had no, as stated before in the chapter, there was no respecting that treaty because, well, why would there be from the Protestant powers? Uh, but it's quite interesting to even see, like, in India, you had Jesuits present in the Islamic in many Hindu courts. I mean, we're whether we'll get onto this. I would also add, even at this time, you had in Japan, the first Europeans to arrive in Japan were Portuguese and Spanish and Jesuits, and they would have been the ones that would uh, you would have early conversions of the Japanese people to Roman Catholicism. So that, I mean, that's what you're seeing is effectively the problem with the English facing it back at this time is the sort of domineering Catholic superpowers of Portugal and Spain.
Yeah, there's definitely sort of a competing between Protestants and Catholics in the New Worlds, and the Jesuits were quite successful in different areas.
Well, one of the things that they were successful in was translation, because they would, the way that they would interact in court is they would be able to translate uh European languages. And the problem that this Hawkins chap, and this was quite smart on his point, is he realized quite quickly that the Jesuit was not being accurate in his translation to the Mughal emperor, and knowing that the Mughals were descendants of Turkic people, remnants of the Mongol, their various Mongol Khanates in Central Asia and so on, that he spoke like, was it a Western Turkic dialect, which the emperor fortunately could understand. But that was just probably sheer chance. So the thing that was, these, remember, have to remember, these Jesuits would have been politically loyal to their monarchs, whether being the Portuguese or Spanish. I mean, their
Well,
loyalty.
overall loyalty specifically to the Pope, actually, not necessarily specifically to their kings on a whole level. The Jesuit order actually takes a specific fealty to the Pope himself.
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, I understand. Yes, I understand what you mean by that, and yes, that loyalty would be there. But I would also add, you know, you like during 1494, you did have the reign of the the Borgia papacy. So the the loyalties, like say from France or somewhere like that, or Portugal, weren't, they I don't think you could say that they were loyal to the papacy in that way, but
now, what I mean, I guess what I mean is,
I
so
don't know
also,
if
sorry, IronDuke.
I was
sorry,
just
go
going to
ahead.
say, if anyone who's watching this might be seeing the TV series which is on at the moment, Shogun, and it's set in about the same time in the early 1600s, and it's the same situation in Japan, in that the Jesuits are the Europeans who are in charge there. And as you say, Connor, they were actually mostly loyal to the Pope, but of course they also were working for the interests of Portugal for the most part as well. And although Portugal is Britain's oldest ally, back then not so much.
Well, yeah, and Portugal's conflict there's nothing that Portugal was doing in this situation that would conflict with the Pope. So therefore, their loyalty would also lie with Portugal. But also at this point, with Queen Elizabeth, the Pope had dissolved, basically, uh, what was it? Basically, had written a document declaring her authority to be unlicit, and that her subjects didn't have to follow her. So basically, that was the papacy at this point was in basically full on war with the English, at least in a not in a swords type of way, not in a guns type of way, but in a political sort of way and spiritual sort of way.
I mean, when the
Yeah,
treaty,
and we
I
were
was,
supporting the Dutch.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, with the Treaty of Toledo and the sort of various Treaty of Saragossa as well. I do reiterate, so I do stand by my claim that there was an interest in the crown, in the sense of India at that time, what was in the mind of the Catholic world, especially the papacy, that part was laid claim to by the Portuguese. If you look in the division in the map, it would have been so. And the actual terms of the treaty was that lands that sits in this quadrant, its land and its people, it effectively belongs to the whether it be Spanish or Portuguese. So um, that's why I'd say there was more political loyalty than, especially for. I mean, I'm not saying the average Jesuit or the average missionary in like a village somewhere in southern India or what have you. This particular one who was in the court, I do think that there was more political loyalty to the crown than for other reasons than just the papacy. That's what my takeaway on that is.
But of course, Portugal actually hung on to bits of India longer than Britain did.
Mm-hmm.
Like Goa,
Yeah,
for example, which was the main Portuguese holding in India. I think it was only, I'm not sure if it was 1960 or 1961, somewhere around that time is when India invaded it. But until then, Goa was still Portuguese. And
Yeah.
Britain gave up India
yeah,
in 1947, of course.
Salazar managed to retain his colonies.
yeah. Same with the Angola and
He did.
Mozambique, and
He did.
yeah, and Macau as well in China. Um, so yeah,
East Timor in not so far from Australia, that was Portuguese.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's correct. Um, all right. Well, I'll continue the chapter. This was the first of many victories won by England in India over her European rivals. Small victory, perhaps, but productive of great results. The consequent adventures of Hawkins in at the Mughal court would fill a book. How he was offered command of the cavalry and the governorship of a province, and how the kindly emperor almost forced him to marry an Armenian damsel. Hawkins, as a loyal servant of the company, was really more concerned to profit by his favour at court, to pave the way for English trade. He convinced uh, uh, Jan- Jangir uh, of the Cambay governor's dishonesty. Uh, Macrib, the governor, was arrested, and goods stolen from the Hector were found in his possession. From then onward, the mastery of English traders over their rivals, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Danes, was only a matter of time. It was the French alone who constituted a real dangerous competitor for India, and they came upon the scene some time after the others. The attention of the French East India Company had at first uh, concentrated upon Madagascar, and they spent nearly 100 years in trying to gain a permanent footing there. Thwarted by the results of the I apologize because I'm reading the passage I'm reading from. The text is a bit smudged. It's a bit smudged. Um, I think it says the resistance of. I imagine the natives. I can't. I think that's what they was getting at. Um, They took possession of a smaller island about 115 miles to the east, which they called Bourbon, but later renamed Rion. This was their base in the Indian Ocean from 16 sometime till 1715. They took a neighboring island known as Mauritius from the Dutch. The French named it Ile-de-France from 1735 to 1746. It was governed by Labradonius, a naval officer of France's most brilliant and enterprise colonial pioneers. During his governorship, the War of Austrian Succession broke out in Europe between England and France. Labradonus conceived the idea of harassing English traders in India by naval raids on their factories. As the trading stations, permanent by the Mongol emperor, were then called, uh, the French by this time had also established factories at Pondicherry, uh, Chandigarh, Yangon, and Mai. The English at this time held Bombay, given by Portugal as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza on her marriage to Charles II. Madras, Fort David near Madras, and Calcutta. Labradornus concentrated his attacks upon the eastern uh, uh, coast, where lay Madras and Fort St. David. He inflicted severe damage, particularly in 1740, but his method clashed with the long-term plan of Dupleix, the then Governor General of the French factories, who had seen possibilities of founding a French empire in India by playing off Indian ruler against the British. The climax of this quarrel came in 1746 when Madras was captured by Labradornus, who gave it back to the British on payment of ransom. This infuriated Dupleix, who accused Labradornus of corruption and had him recalled to France in disgrace. Um, so yeah, in this account here, we have uh, you see the rivalry really is mainly France, and it's quite interesting because in this at this particular point, Catholic France isn't in many ways is infringing on the Portuguese claim, going back to the treaties I mentioned earlier. What do we think about this?
I'd say that by this point it was more considered guidelines than anything else, and the French weren't even considered a country that could be stabilized at the time of the treaty. There was the religious wars of France was enough destabilizing them that had prevented them from colonizing at that point, anyways.
Yes, and I
Yeah,
imagine, but
the Treaty of, I think it was the Treaty of Zaragoza, wasn't it? That
yes,
divided the world up between Portugal and Spain.
yeah,
By the 18th century, that was pretty much a dead letter. So
yeah,
Also,
pretty much.
I think it's interesting
yeah,
that with Catherine of Braganza, was there was a piece of land. I can't. Was it Madras? What was it that was
Um,
transferred?
I think it was Bombay.
Sorry,
I think.
Bombay was transferred from Portugal to England for in her marriage as part of her dowry. Anyways, I just thought that was interesting.
Also, the first battle honour of the British Army dates from then as well. There's another part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry was Tangier in North Africa. And the earliest battle honour any British Army regiment has is Tangier.
That's quite interesting,
In the early
actually. And
1600s.
Do you guys know
so
what
that
they mean by factories? I don't, because I can't imagine it's the exact same thing. We'd assume factories.
It
and
was
like,
just the normal name for it. it was the normal name for a trading station and above all warehouses. What we would call
Yeah,
warehouses today, in the 18th century, they called factories, and they continued to do so into the 19th century. In China, for
Connor,
example, they were always called factories. But
in yes, that's right. I say, Connor, if you look at the in Canada, in Rupert's Land or everything, some textbooks, some books might refer to like the factories of Rupert's Land or something. So yes, it's as IronDuke said, it was a term that was used um, as like trading points or large. I mean, I don't want to say economic zones, but that's basically what it comes down to. If you
yeah,
um,
they really meant warehouses. In modern terms, they would have called them warehouses
yeah, warehouses for
because they were able to store trading goods there and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Gotcha.
yeah. So yeah, I think that's we'll continue onwards. This friction contributed greatly to saving the English footing on the Commodore coast. But the really the Commodore coast, I think that's the eastern coast of India that we're referring to there. But the really decisive factor in turning the tide for England was the appearance on the scene of Robert Clive. Uh, Clive landed in Madras in 1743 as a junior writer or clerk of the East India Company. By nature, he was a fighter rather than a pen pusher, and he soon found his true calling. Within 3 years of his arrival, his first chance to distinguish himself came in the storming of Madras by the French. Dupleix had repudiated the promise of Labradornus and retaken the town. Clive's escape through the enemy lines to Fort St. David, his efficient share in its defense, and the courage and enterprise shown by him in the storming of Devocta all contributed towards earning for him the reputation of an outstanding leader in war. It was as well for the East India Company that such a man emerged at the moment, for on the French side Dupleix had been carrying all before him. The crisis reached climax in 1751 when Dupleix's ambitious scheme for French empire building began to bear fruit. To clarify the events of 1751 to 1757, a brief a recaption will help. When the Emperor uh, Aurangzeb died in 1707, the Mongol Empire rapidly disintegrated. Its viceroys assumed the role of independent rulers, even if they nominally recognized the Delhi overlordship. Rivals fought and plotted for mastery of the new kingdoms, and the general unrest rapidly affected the European traders. Historians often skim lightly over this early relationship of the French and English trading companies, as though mutual hostility between them only erupted in the time of Clive and Dupleix. This interpretation of history is only partially true. A more accurate picture of the early days is one of constant antagonism, suspicion, and rivalry from the very earliest days between the trading establishment of all four European nations: English, French, Portuguese, and Dutch. While the Mughal Empire remained an effective power, this inter-European rivalry was kept without bou- uh, bounds. The Dutch and the Portuguese gradually faded into insignificance, leaving the English and French as growing concerns. With records written at the time, it is clear that public opinion among Indians of the South regarded war between France and English as inevitable. At a very early date, local rulers, landowners, and merchants acquired a high degree of cunning in playing off one European race against the other. For their part, the attitude of English to French and vice versa varied roughly in proportion to the proximity of the individual Europeans to the Indian scene. Thus, the actual people on the spot, from highest to lowest, had no illusions at all, whether in actually, I'll stop there because we've come to the end of that page. So, what we see here is the disintegration of the Mughal Empire and the um, the sort of rise of I guess that you would see this would be sort of the rise of the various Hindu states, which then become the Martha Confederacy, as it would be titled later on. Um, and the two competing powers in this is France and England, and their through their companies, that is. So what do we think about that particular bit? Because of course we now Clive of India is on the scene.
I think it's interesting how we're going to be able to see how this decentralized, basically, country now that is now uh, completely broken up is going to be, um, it's going to be necessary to work with the English or the French in the upcoming battles, as well as how the British are able to bring around different. I think, is it Maharajas?
Yes, Maharajas. Yeah, yeah. No, it's an interesting one because we also we know due to the breakup of the Mughal Empire. Because just to give people a clue, the Mughal Empire's dominance is modern day Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, um, excluding the southern Tamil regions. The Mughal empires would spread most of what would be the Indian subcontinent, and for that to fracture was for the Indians, for the powers, that power at that time centered in Delhi was fatal, because of course the Mughals wouldn't bounce back from that. Sorry, IronDuke, carry on.
No, I was just going to say this is for people who watched earlier episodes of this stream. It's very much the counterpart of what was going on in North America at the same time between the British and the French. And it's happening at the same time as what North Americans tend to call the French and Indian Wars, which is of course the 7 Years' War. So it's kind of it's the exact counterpart of that. And the way the British East India Company gradually came to rule India was largely by replacing the Mughals, because of course India as a concept didn't really exist at that time at all. So the Brits basically moved in as the Mughals disintegrated and kind of replaced them gradually.
Yeah, one thing I always thought quite interesting with Indian history, and there's this sort of, when you look at Russia or India or China, there's this really funny aspect with their history where you have long periods, where the people governing them are foreigners, and not just like pure ethnic foreigners, but foreigners when it comes to religion and other aspects as well. Though they would sometimes adapt. But if you look at the Mughals, they were originally of Turkic origin. Um, they were Muslims. Bearing in mind they would be governing over largely Hindu and Sikh and then a few Christians in the south, and then not to mention maybe the odd Buddhists and what have you, but largely Hindu populations. But then the court, part of their courtiers, or the official language at court, would be Persian. And so it would be like this really odd blend of this truly, this empire. And the trouble is, it while its strength itself was on its, its might, its military might and everything. And it's really funny because when you look at the history of India, that the Indians seem to have this, um, are very accepting to be governed by by the others. I mean, of course, up until 1947, but it's just it's a funny trait in Indian history that they're every now and then they'll have some either Persian or Mameluke or Turkic warriors dynasty which will sweep in from Afghanistan and the Punjab and then create a sultanate or empire to govern over the the subcontinent.
Yeah, but India, as I say, India really as a concept, as a country, it certainly didn't exist as a country, but India as a concept even didn't really exist until the British created it, to be honest.
No, it's like Africa. It's a geographic region. It wasn't in any ways
Yes, very
a,
much so.
a nation in any sort of conceivable mind. No, that's absolutely true. And I mean, yes, the conflict as well with going on at the same time as the French Indian Wars and the British capture, culminating in the British capture of French Canada. So no, definitely. Right, we'll continue. Whether in Europe there happened to be peace or war between France and England mattered little to their countrymen in India. Just as North America, so also in India, peace might be signed at Ryswick, Utrecht, or Axel-Chapelle, and might last easily for a few years in Europe. But in India, Pondicherry and Madras, Calcutta and Shanghagur watched and plotted against one another and intermittently broke into war. In times of official peace in Europe, this local feeling was neither shared nor approved by the authorities of either country who were remote from the Indian scene. Directors of the East India Company bombarded their subordinates with letters deploring what they considered too much uh, uh, truculent attitude taken locally towards some Indian ruler or towards a neighboring French trading post. On the French side, this divergence of view between men on the spot and others was clearly exemplified in a quarrel between Labradonus and Dupleix. The former was a nobleman of the old school, chivalrous and correct in his behaviour to those with whom the king was at war. As governor of Mauritius, it never occurred to him to harass the English in India until proper war broke out between the two countries. Even then, his object was purely military, on assisting France to win the war. He had no idea of participating in a local commercial feud between the two rival East Indian companies. This was shown by his chivalrous treatment of Madras both before and after capturing it. Dupleix, Dupleix was a man of very different stamp, crafty and unscrupulous. As governor of Pondicherry and a high official of the French East India Company, his whole outlook was that of the man on the spot and a shrewd one too. To him, the handing back of Madras by Labradonus seemed a piece of chivalrous folly. No sooner had the admiral been forced by a storm to withdraw his fleet from Madras than Dupleix violated the agreement and retook the city, treating it and its garrison with ferocity. Soon after this, disintegration of the Mughal Empire began to be felt in southern India. Uh, Nimzan ul Mulk, viceroy of Deccan, died, and the usual struggle for the succession broke out. It so happened that one of the uh, Duke, one of the provinces in that part of southern India. I can't pronounce it. It's beyond my. Known as the Carnatic, had its Nawab, a very aged man, a good friend of the English, whose factory of Madras lay within Carnatic province. During the course of the struggle for the viceroyalty of uh, Deccan, an ambitious usurper, Chunda Sahib, invaded the Carnatic with intent to dethrone the old ruler. Dupleix, seeing a chance of dominating both Deccan and the Carnatic by installing a puppet ruler in each, gave full French uh, support to Musafa Jang, a pretender to the Deccan, and Chandra for a pretender for the Deccan, and to Chunda Shahib, who was trying to overturn the old friend of the English in Carnatic. I'm going to continue on because there wasn't really much in that passage there, but it was this development in 1751 brought Anglo-French rivalry in southern India to a sudden dangerous head. The old friend of the English was defeated and killed in battle. His son Muhammad Ali had to flee to Trichinopoly, leaving Chunda Sahib to occupy the most of the Carnatic, including its capital, uh, Arcot. During the next few weeks, the fortunes of the British and of Muhammad Ali reached a very low level. A British and Indian force sent from Madras to protect Muhammad Ali was disgracefully routed and driven in confusion under the walls of uh, Trichinopoli. The army of Chunda Sahib, with his French allies, laid siege to the town. By now, almost the last uh, peg upon which hung any hope of a British survival in southern India. Loss of morale, amounting almost to panic, numbered the British authorities in Fort St. David and Madras. It was at this desperate juncture that Clive proposed his daring plan to restore the situation. Clive saw that it would be worse than useless to send reinforcements to Trinopoly to join the demoralized remnant crouching under its walls. The threatened town lay on the far side of Pondicherry, the French base. Any force sent from Madras or St. David would be struck in the flank by the French before getting anywhere near Trichinopoli. Much closer to Madras lay Arcot, where Chunda Sahib had recently set up his base from which to conduct the siege of Trinopoly. Counterattack, Clive saw, would be the best form of defence. A sharp blow against Chunda Sahib's base would make him relax his pressure on Trinopoly. It says much for the military reputation already gained by Clive that this 26-year-old man was able to persuade a group of panic-stricken old men to let him try his plan. It was a brilliant success. With a force of 200 Europeans and 300 sepoys. By the way, sepoys are the native Indian troops deployed by the company, just for people who might not know. He got within 10 miles of Akart when a thunderstorm, very prolonged and accompanied by torrential rain, fell upon them. Further progress seemed quite impossible, and the troops expected their commander to order a halt. But Clive realized that the sheer difficulty of advancing would help him to achieve surprise, so the force pushed on. Its sudden emergence through the storm not only surprised the enemy, but filled them with an almost superstitious terror. Town and citadel were both abandoned, with hardly a shot fired. No time was to be lost for Clive knew that Chunda Sahib would react quickly to the loss of his base. He just had time to provisioned the citadel for a long siege, when a column of various estimate at 3 to 7,000 men entered the city. Some had come from Trinopoly, thus proving the soundness of Clive's plan. Others converged from Valour, and the French contingent of 150 joined from Pondicherry. So, I mean, it was really Clive's tactical mind that really saved the British position in uh, in India at that point, because it does seem that there was this the French were quite close to cutting the Brits out of southern India altogether.
I like the comparison of sort of this the chivalrous French leader versus sort of the unscrupulous French leader, and how the how their attitudes towards sort of creating this situation led to Clive being able to outsmart um, the the unchivalrous leader. To be honest, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, he definitely out outsmarted them, and the thing was, because there was they mentioned panic set in within the company. Remember, this was a company of bureaucrats and administrators largely, that he was able to convince them of this plan. And to be honest, I think they were in such a desperate situation that any plan they would have agreed to. And I mean, Clive had already sort of proven himself competent ruler at this point, but this was his this was his moment to shine.
I think it's worth bearing in mind that Clive didn't go to India as a military man. He went there as a writer, which basically means a clerk. He went out there as a quite minor clerk, and he must have been a pretty extraordinary man in order to gain command of such forces as the British East India Company had in those days. So I think that's worth bearing in mind.
No,
Like, he was in
definitely,
no
and
sense a professional soldier.
no, but he does seem to be, as we get on, he does seem to be quite a capable tactician in like guessing his opponent's moves, or sort of a, I mean, like a almost like a real sort of savvy chess player or something. It's he definitely seems to be
Yes,
that
absolutely.
tactician.
He did. He had natural tactical skill, and he was also very good at getting involved in Indian politics and diplomacy as well. He was also good at that.
No, and I mean, just goes to show, it's the one man sort of a great man figure is able to channel the change of what seems like the inevitable rise of French dominance. Because that's sort of is what happened. It sort of backfired. And Connor's right. The ironic thing is, it happened on the person who was the most least chivalric figure was the one who got his sort of backside handed to him effectively. Um, and this is on this is at the time where you see the change in warfare, where that sort of gentlemanly behavior, that knightly understanding of warfare was, I mean, coming to a close. I mean, of course, it wouldn't be till Napoleon you have the concept of all-out total war, and any sort of and so that you had but this is like this is right before the understanding of warfare changing to from what it had been before. So it was a quite important one. Uh, Connor, how are we doing for time for you?
I have to go soon.
You're gonna have to go. Um, do you want us to continue this chapter, or
Yeah, you guys continue. I'll be leaving soon, and I'll just catch up for the next episode.
okay? I think the next episode is on consolidation, so that I haven't even looked at the next chapter actually, so I can't tell you what that's on, but that's probably uh I mean, as I said, the one that probably be interesting would be the 1812 when we Napoleonic Wars. 1812 will be the important one. And it'd be nice to get Iron Duke back for that one as well, because I think that would be a especially Napoleonic conflict.
Look, I'm very happy to join you anytime you like, but I would just say this particular chapter is a fairly long chapter.
Yes.
And from the point of view of your channel going through the book, I think it would be a good idea to knock this one off today if we can, because it is quite a long chapter, and it in some ways, I mean, I understand why the author did it, but because he's had to cover all of North America in the chapter before this, up until the end of the American War of Independence, in some ways, in chronological order, he's going over some of the same stuff in this chapter. So
Yes.
it might be a good idea to just knock this one off in the interests of making this particular series last less than 18 months or whatever it's going to last otherwise.
On current trajectory, I think we can get it done by the end of this year. Probably about December this year, I think. So on current trajectory, I think we can manage that.
Yeah, if you're trying to do in general a chapter a stream, yeah, that's probably the way you should try and do it, I reckon.
Well, I'll head out. Everyone, God bless, and have a good rest of your Holy Week.
Yeah, happy Easter, everyone.
Yeah, happy Easter. Happy Easter.
Okay, Iron Duke. We will continue the chapter. What I might do, Iron Duke, is because I know that time is just not on our side, and this is a very long chapter. What I might do is, shall I just read the whole chapter now, and then we can talk about points. We'll make notes as we go along, and then talk about points afterwards.
If you want to, yeah. If you want to,
because
I'm quite happy. Yeah, I'm quite happy to interrupt you if something important happens, but a lot of it is, unless someone actually studies this period of India, and I have a bit, a lot of it is not going to be vastly interesting. Sorry, that's not the right word. A lot of it, some modern viewers won't really get, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's better to get the whole whole
so yeah, by all
day.
means, if you want to just read the chapter and then we can talk over the points afterwards, that would be fine as far as I'm concerned.
All right, I will do that. So to continue here, the siege that followed surpassed even the recent capture of Arcot, and in the renown which it won for the name of Clyde among the southern Indian population, the sepoys henceforward regarded him with the adoration which they always gave to personal courage in a leader. Clive added to his complete disregard for danger, a flair for Oriental warfare, and sympathetic interest in the mentality, the customs, and language of his troops. With the possible exception of John Nicholas, it is doubtful whether another British officer has equalled Clive in these respects, though many in lesser degree followed his example. The siege of Arcot lasted 11 weeks. It was a rarity among sieges in being a victory for the defense without any outside aid from a relieving force. The numerical odds were about 35 to 1 in favor of the besiegers. Clive's troops, reduced by casualties to 200 or less, had effectively had difficulty in manning the huge perimeter. It was outstanding feat among the world's great siegers.
Could I just say one thing, AI?
Yeah.
Could I just say one thing, AI? When people watching this are imagining Clive, they have to think of somebody a bit like a land version of Sir Francis Drake. He was very much that kind of piratical figure, yeah, but on land.
Yes.
So if you can imagine somebody like an Elizabethan sea dog, but on land, that was the sort of man that Clive was.
A lot of lefties, a lot of Indian nationalists today refer to Clive as the thief of India. That's quite a common. Yeah, that's quite a common. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know why
Whereas
they're
in fact he was more of a land pirate than anything else. He really was.
I mean, you could
and I really
argue
admire him. Yeah.
you could argue he was the thief of the French East India Company. Probably an accurate title, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't say the
Yeah.
thief of India though. I think that's just a load of
Well,
nonsense.
how could you be the thief of something that didn't exist? You know, India, as we already said, India as a nation and even as a concept didn't exist in the 18th century. It just didn't. So you can't really be a thief of something that doesn't exist. You know, it's like it was a subcontinent made up of various states. You know, it wasn't one place. People who lived in India didn't think of themselves as Indians.
No, and the as you said, the southern Indian population were largely indifferent because they were aware that their rulers were French puppets. They were installed by French puppets
Yes.
after coup d'états, and Clive kicked them out. I mean, that's effectively what happened. The French company's
Yeah,
out.
very much so. Very much so.
Yeah, I'll continue. It was also the turning point in the Anglo-French struggle for southern India. Dupleix continued to fight till his replacement by the Comité de Lally 3 years later. By this time, Bengal had supplanted the south as the main theatre of war. The governor and the council at Fort William, the company's establishment in Calcutta, had watched with growing apprehension the course of events in the Carnatic, but had done little to strengthen their own position for fear of offending the Nawab of Bengal. Now, no, Nawab, for people wondering, that's, if I remember, that's basically like local rulers. That's sort of what it means. It's a local provincial ruler, Indian ruler, or like a class of. It's hard to. IronDuke, Nawab, isn't that like a class of like knights, Indian knights, if I'm correct?
Yeah, it's kind of like that. I mean, it's not exactly that, but yeah. I mean, if someone's a nawab, they're a sort of they're a ruler. Not always a local ruler. They're sometimes a ruler of what, in terms of European territory, would be quite a lot of land. But they're obviously underneath other people, you know.
Yeah, well, better example. If you look at the caste system,
the Mughals weren't. The Mughals were only replaced in 1858. The last Mughal emperor was known as the King of Delhi, and he was still living in Delhi in the Red Fort in 1857 at the time of the Indian Mutiny. But he had no power whatsoever, really, by that stage. So the Mughals weren't actually really physically replaced, but they just didn't have any. They got less and less power, basically.
Yeah, no, I was gonna. I was just thinking. To describe them, there were a warrior caste of land owning, these land owning warriors who would have mixed sort of sized territory. Some of them would be very large and powerful. Some of them would be, average size, but they were below Maharajas and in the pecking order of things. So yes, we shall continue. If I can find where. So yeah, in fear of offending the Nawab of Bengal. In fact, the board of directors in London had reversed their unusual tendency of restraining their subordinates from too vigorous action. In 1748, they had caused to reprimand the Calcutta branch for the timidity and lack of initiative to face the coming danger. Even this did not stir the Calcutta men to action. Consequently, when Suraj ud Dawal, a viciously cruel young man, became Nawab in April 1756, Fort William was still in no fit state to resist an attack. The new ruler soon showed his hatred for the English and his uh, uh, avaricious intention towards the wealth which he wrongly believed to be stored in the fort. Plans were made for evacuation of British women and children in large numbers of ships that were always lying in the Hooghly River. However, when the Nawab advanced with large army at alarming speed, scenes of panic broke out on the waterfront. The confusion was such that control of the of the uh, control of the embarkation failed. The ships, probably under the impression that all had been taken aboard, dropped down the river on the eve. It has even been alleged that some historians, particularly those writing soon after events, that the governor and council, together with other influential Europeans, were guilty of flagrant cowardice, resulting in a deliberate premature departure of ships. John Cook, secretary to the governor and council, was one of the unfortunates left behind. He survived the Black Hole of Calcutta and lived to give evidence at a subsequent House of Commons inquiry. His evidence was certainly significant, speaking of what happened after departure of the ships from the uh, uh, quaysides. He said signals were. So this is his account that's been cited here. Signals were now thrown out from every part of the fort for the ships to come up again to their stations. But in the 2 days that the fort held out, never was a single effort made to send a boat or vessel to bring off any part of the garrison. Another report said a single sloop with 15 brave men on board might, in spite of all efforts of the enemy, have come up and anchoring under the fort have carried away all who subsequently suffered in the dungeon, aka Black Hole Calcutta. To one who knows the terrific tides of the Hooghly at this present, writer does, a that being Richard Hilton, he knows the river quite in depth. A simple explanation suggests itself. When the ebb tide was running fully, it may have been a sheer impossibility for any ship to return upstream to Fort William after once having cast off. It should be remembered that seagoing sailing ships would not have been easily maneuverable in that narrow river, especially under light airs or calms which probably prevailed there during the month of June. It seems easier to accept this explanation than believe that the English seamen and their officers would deliberately have abandoned their compatriots, or that a man bearing the fine English name of Drake could have displayed such cowardice and such treachery towards his subordinates has been imputed to the governor. On the other hand, it cannot be denied that he and his chief officers embarked before ensuring that all his subordinates were safe, conducted an unpleasant contrast to that of British commander at Dunkirk. So we're referring to the evacuation at Dunkirk here. Neither can it be denied the tides of the Hooghly only ebb for a few hours, and the fort held out 2 days after departure of the ships. This failure to return upstream, however, may be due to the fact that the signals from the fort were not seen. There seems to have been no acknowledgement from any of the ships. Whatever the cause, the fact remains that the ships departed, leaving behind 146 Europeans who were subsequently crammed for a while in night into a room with 18 feet square, the notorious Black Hole of Calcutta, whence 23, including one woman, were taken out alive. There has even been controversy about this. It has been suggested by some writers that the Nawab himself was not personally guilty. Exponents of this story refer to the civility which he showed to Mr. Holwell, the senior of the prisoners, when a letter was brought before him. They claim that the choice of the small room for so great a number of prisoners was merely an act of Oriental stupidity, done by minor officials without the acknowledgement of the Nawab. It may be so, but there's no mere stupidity about the conduct of the guards during that night. Some of them mocked the suffocating inmates, holding water up into the window but snatching it away again. Others, it is true, were more humane, but even these refused to remedy the mistake, if it was a mistake, that is, on the excuse that only the Nawab could authorize the removal to another prison cell. They said that the Nawab was asleep and that none dared wake him up. This seems to indicate either that the Nawab was aware of the prison arrangement, or else that he was so terrible a tyrant that none dared to awake him, even to rectify this ghastly blunder. At this late date, it does not really matter much whether Suracha Ud Dawal was guilty or not, or again, neither Drake and his council were guilty of cowardice or not. The controversy has been outlined simply to show that at all stages of our imperial history there um, have been writers anxious to blacken the good name of Englishmen and whitewash the enemies of our country, even those closely involved in bestial crimes. Whatever we believe about it today, there is no there is no doubt concerning its effect on public opinion in Madras and Fort St. David. It was resolved that a combined combined naval and military force should be sent to Hulugi to restore the situation, and for the East India Company in Calcutta to push those guilty of the massacre. Nearly 6 months were wasted, however, in putting this resolution into effect. There was much argument as to the choice of the commander, but eventually Clive was selected. That's a good choice. In December 1756, the expedition reached the Hulugi, having been delayed by adverse winds in the Bay of Bengal, as well as the long-winded debates of the planning committee. Um, Admiral Watson commanded the fleet, a blunt and honest sailor destined to find himself in serious disagreement on at least one occasion with somewhat Oriental outlook of Clive. Suracha Ud Dawal appears to have been taken by surprise when the British fleet entered the Hulugi and disembarked an army of about 3,000, one-third of whom were white. To gain time, he opened negotiations with Clive, who did not rebuff his approaches, though it is unlikely that either of them were genuinely seeking peace. A month after the British landing, the Nawab appeared before Calcutta with a huge army and commenced an investment of the place, at the time carrying on his negotiations with Clive. It would be tedious and unprofitable to study in detail the extraordinary mixture of talks and combats which took place during this following months, as both talks and combats were only moves in the game of Oriental cunning and aimed to bolster the Izzat, or renown either of the Nawab or of Clive. It's hardly surprising that the blunt admiral became impatient. He did not understand what was going on. Looking back with knowledge that we now possess, it's clear that Clive foresaw the necessity not only making an end of French influence in India, but also deposing Suraj ud Dawla and replacing him with some compliant puppet through whom the East India Company might restore order in Bengal. In fact, he saw the wisdom of Duplessis' plan as well as the need for ruining its uh, innovator. But Clive was probably the only Englishman at that time with such clear vision of the possibilities and dangers. He had to cope, therefore, not only with the wily Suraj ud Dawla and the shrewd Frenchman of Chandragore, but also deal with the silly intrigues of the East India Company's senior officials both in Madras and Calcutta. It is scarcely credible, but nonetheless true, that Mr. Drake, the governor whose departure from Calcutta roused invidious comments, had had now been reinstated there and used his position to thwart Clive in every possible way. As being a nominee of the Madras presidency, with whom the Calcutta presidency was perpetually on terms of mutual distrust and jealousy. In these difficult conditions of intrigue and obstruction from those who ought to have supported him, Clive conducted his scheme for exploiting the hatred for Suraj ud Dawla, which was known to be rife among his subjects and in his court at Murshidabad. Prominent among conspirators known to be preparing a palace revolt was Miri uh, Jafar, Miri Jafar, commander of the Nawab's army. Clive opened secret negotiations with Miri Jafar, and in doing so involved him in a disreputable affair which unfortunately stained the good name of this otherwise great Englishman. It extenuation for Clive, it must be remarkable. It must be remembered that he was acting alone in the interests of his country and employers, that he was dealing with the craftiest of Orientals, with whom a straight deal was almost impossible, and that he could not trust even his English colleagues, except perhaps Admiral Watson, who was too blunt and uh, guileless to see the need for any trickery at all. But when all this had been allowed in his favour, it is hard to deny that he went rather too far in outwitting a knave and knavery. Uh, this is the sad, unsavoury story. The secret negotiations with Marie Jafar was conducted through a shady Bengali merchant banker named Umachand. Um, though fabulously wealthy, he was utterly unscrupulous. He first came into the business by offering a price to ruin Suraj ud Dawali, who had treated him fairly and generously, compensating him with full for his losses during the Calcutta fighting. That um, Om Omachand was the merchant in question, was a man who would betray anybody for money, was soon to be amply proved. When agreement had been reached through Umachand for Mir Jafar to desert his master at a critical point in the coming battle, when all concerned had set their signatures to the thoroughly incriminating document, Umachand suddenly showed his hand. He threatened to disclose the entire plot to Suraj ud Dawla unless he Umachand, the merchant, was paid £300,000 sterling. It was a preposterous sum for those days, and in any case, Clive could not trust him to keep a silence, even if this sum was paid to him. Not only the whole plan of campaign was threatened with ruin, Mir Jafar had and a large number of high officials in Murshidabad were deeply implicated and would face torture and agonizing deaths. Besides this, the tiny British army had already crossed the Huluki and put itself in position of dire peril if Mir Jaffar's part in the coming battle failed to materialize. At all costs, Umachand must be silenced till after the battle, but Clive neither possessed the money, demand, nor would willingly have paid it, so he resorted to trick. Umachand expressed willingness to wait for the money in if meanwhile given a security. What he demanded was a copy of a secret treaty containing a clause in which Mirajaf would promise on becoming a Nawab in Suraj ut Dawal's place to pay Umachand the stipulated sum. He considered excuse me, he considered that this would bind all the conspirators far more completely than any written proofs of the conspiracy which he hitherto possessed. Clive had two copies of the treaty prepared. The genuine version was on white paper and made no mention of Umachand or his reward. The second copy, on red paper, was a sham. It contained the clause demanded by the banker. But in order to carry out his deception, it was vital for Clive to obtain the Admiral's signature to both documents in addition to his own signature. Watson, the Admiral, refused. But somehow or other, when the fictitious copy was handed to Umachand, something purporting to be the Admiral's signature had been inserted in the appropriate place.
Yeah, I think it was forged, mate. The signature was forged.
I think so. I'm surprised that Clive didn't hire like a thuggy to silence the merchant or something, or hire.
Oh no, he needed him to keep up his end of the bargain. Clive was not in the 19th century AI. Clive was not always the most popular of figures in British history because he did not live up to that absolutely straight man of his word thing that 19th century Victorian gentleman was supposed to be. Because don't forget, Clive was operating in the mid 18th century, which is a very different time. And also in India, of course, which was, quite corrupt to say the least at that stage. But yeah, I think Clive did forge the signature, or had someone forge the signature. And the author of the book knows it, but he's trying to be as reasonably generous to Clive as he can be. I think Clive was very definitely a great man, but he would not, in the 19th century, have been regarded as an honourable Christian gentleman, shall we say?
Yeah, that's true, and I do wonder if that's where the sort of hatred for Clive, because of course, during the Cultural Revolution of 2020, a great deal of names. There was a school, I believe, which had a house, like one of those school houses, which was named Clive, and there was a what was it? Yeah, there was one in Wales, I think, in Newport, and then there was there was an attempt in Shropshire Council to remove a statue of Clive, which was fortunately it was voted. Okay, Shropshire Council, so pretty solidly conservative, and They were the Conservative Party, and they were debating whether or not to remove a statue of Clive. But and there was like 200,000 signatures to to remove it. So there was we forget. I mean, that was a
Most
disastrous
of them
year.
recent immigrants who didn't live in Shropshire, right?
But and that was the time when I saw the term thief of India, and I think and this wasn't just from like your Punjabi bankers or what have you. This was from your living in Britain, but this was like from white leftists, and there seems to be this legacy of Clive that because he was sort of working in he operated within the black economy in some regards of like skullduggery and
he was a man of his time. He was a mid 18th century man. He wasn't a 19th century Christian dude. He was a mid 18th century man, which was a different time, and he was operating in India. And to call Indian politics and diplomacy in the mid 18th century corrupt would be an understatement. It was just the way it was, and you've got to judge him by the standards of when he was operating and where he was operating, and by those standards he was no worse than anybody else and better than most.
Well, no, that's absolutely correct. And then this is something that is just ridiculous because he's like out of anyone on the ground, maybe that one French governor who was against the sort of chivalrous other French governor general. He was like the one figure that was actually quite political, like in based in realpolitik. He was thinking long term for the company. I mean, Richard Hilton said that he was not thinking like in 10 years.
And also, don't forget something. Clive was in charge of the military force, the British military force, and so he was responsible for the lives of about 3,000 men. About 2,000 of them Indians and 1,000 of them British soldiers. And if he made a mistake, that army was going to get crushed by the vastly superior enemy forces, because he was very much outnumbered, hugely so. So if he made some sort of diplomatic or political error, his army was all going to get killed, and he was responsible for that army. So you can take that into account as well.
I mean, I just found an article, and it's like this, like the Hindu Times or whatever it's called, and it's this most ridiculous thing, and it's basically claiming that he brought corruption to Bengal. Like Clive literally brought corruption and courtly intrigue to the Indians. That's just fucking ridiculous.
That's like saying someone brought corruption to Ukraine. I mean, it's just craziness. It's like.
Well, I mean, the Biden family did you probably could argue that in some ways with the American regime a bit, but yeah,
I think they just found a happy home, but that's just me.
I mean, let's be honest. A lot of post-Soviet Russia was corrupt anyway. So yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, it is always been corrupt. I just find that funny that you have like this Indian, like this Bengal Indian merchant blackmailing Clive trying to get one over on him, and like the legacy is like, I know Clive was like the exploiter one. It's like this fucking Indian guy was like was exploiting his allies against the Nawab and also Clive as well. I mean, fucking hell.
Yeah, Clive merely turned the tables on him. Is all that happened.
In continental Europe, I mean, as I said, like, if what they would do really is the merchant, if he had any sons or heirs, they would be kidnapped and they would be basically held as like because if you start in the realm of blackmailing other people, other sort of powerful people, you have to be careful, because that's usually when kidnappings and plots come into guarantees. You see, so you shouldn't like bite the hand that feeds you, sort of thing, because that never ends well for anybody. But yeah.
I totally agree. And I mean, the £300,000 sterling that this dude was asking would be, hundreds of millions in today's money.
And of course, Parliament.
Yeah.
Of course, Parliament and the directors of the company would notice this financial transaction. They'd be like, "What's this for? What's this for, Clive?"
It was never, even if Clive had wanted to pay him, he couldn't. Yeah.
No,
there's no way Clive could have given him that amount of money, even had he wanted to.
Yeah, Omachand, the merchant in this, who's sort of blackmailing everybody, but both like the rival Nawab, the Nawab's general, and Clive. I mean, he's like the ultimate shit stain in this, from what I can understand. He's the one that's like really, yeah.
Well, yeah, he's the guy who is actually the traitor to the bloke who's employing him, which is the Nawab. So it's like
yeah. So I hope the merchant got his comeuppance in the end, because I'm reading this. I'm like, I hope he gets like chucked into the black hole of Calcutta or something. We'll find out. Yeah, I hope he gets his comeuppance. Malakali categorically accused Clive of forgery. It is doubtful whether his hand actually held the pen, but morally he must bear the blame. The trick worked. The treacherous banker was deceived, and it is said that after the battle, when shown the genuine document without a mention of his name, he went mad and shortly afterward died of rage and broken hearts. Okay. So that was the end of the merchant then. God, imagine his face. He must have really like been furious. Probably gave himself like an aneurysm or something. Anyway, it is a pity that Plassey, one of the finest battles in British history, should have had its prelude. Should had as its prelude this piece of rascality. The battle itself was a straightforward affair in which the steadfastness of the troops rather than any special skill of the commander's part decided the day. The night before the battle was spent by Clive's 3,000 men and their backs to a large grove of mango trees, and behind that again the wide river, flooded by monsoon rains. It was a position from which the orderly retreat could have been difficult, if not impossible. Ahead of them, across the flat paddy fields, could be heard the low murmur of an enormous army. Estimates after the battle put them at over 15,000 men, though a part of this horde, it should be remembered, was under direct command of Miri Jaffe, the prospective traitor. So, in theory, they could have turned on the Nawab in battle if ordered. Clive is reported to have spent a sleepless night pacing the mango grove in anxious thought. Never before had he shown such nervousness before battle, and well he might on in this tremendous occasion. See, I don't think IronDuke he was actually thinking about the battle. I think he was more thinking about because this time the merchant was still alive, and the plotting was still going on. I think he was more worried about that, whether he could pull this all off.
Oh yeah, look, I mean, as I said earlier, the Clive was tremendously outnumbered by the enemy forces, including, of course, the French allies of the Indians he was fighting. And a single mistake on Clive's part would have seen his army massacred, without a doubt.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely. So I think it wasn't so much the battle, the actual battle. I mean, of course, that would. I think for him, it was the whole political intrigue that he was involved with, and also,
sure.
I mean, what would have been if he was discovered to have been forging the documents of an admiral? What would have been his punishments for that?
Oh, I think he would have got into quite a lot of trouble for that. Yes, Because bear in mind, he went out to India as a writer, as a clerk. So he was not some sort of aristocrat, you know. He was very much a lower middle class kind of chap, you know.
Yes. His profound understanding of Indian affairs told him that this battle would decide the fate of the British in India, perhaps even the fate of the whole war with France. Many factors were there to worry him: the vast discrepancy in numbers, the uncertainty whether Mir Jafar would keep his words, and the tactically perilous position of the 3,000 with their backs to the formidable defiles. Fortunately, the commander's anxiety was not shared by his troops. The British are reported to have slept well and stood to arms as dawn approached, if not confident of victory, at any rate determined to deserve it. As for the 2,000 sepoys, their faith in Clive was absolute. A huge army advanced across the fields in great line, overlapping the British flanks on both sides. Amazement was caused by the size of the Nawab's artillery and the numbers of his guns. Huge pieces of Indian manufacture, fueled by teams of white oxen and pushed by elephants, rumbled across the plain at a surprising rapid speed in front of the infantry. When the guns came within
I
a
think
few
it's
hundred yards,
I think it's worth mentioning that right up until the 1840s and the Anglo-Sikh Wars, Indian armies often had more guns and bigger artillery guns than the British Army did. And you know, it's often said that, you know, the Brits conquered India because they had better technology. It's not true. That is simply not true. Indian armies very often had more guns than the British forces they were facing, and their guns were often bigger. You know, they'd have 12 and 18 pounders rather than British 6 and 9 pounders, you know. That was the case right up until the Anglo-Sikh Wars in the 1840s, when the Sikhs famously had more and bigger guns than the British artillery did.
oh no, definitely, and we'll see this with we talked about this on, I think, your channel, IronDuke, right back along with with Arthur Wellesley and his time in India during the war with the Mysore
Yes.
state.
Yep.
We definitely
Yep.
saw that.
The Indian forces often had very powerful artillery, very powerful, and more powerful than the British forces.
No, definitely. When the guns came within a few hundred yards of the British front line, hold on a sec, front line, they unlimbered and commenced a heavy bombardment. Fortunately, their aim was not accurate, and most of the projectiles exploded in the mango grove behind. But the roar of the passage close above the heads of Clive's men and the din of the guns themselves, and the explosions behind, would have shaken the nerves of less disciplined troops. Neither British nor sepoys showed any signs of unsteadiness under this ordeal. In fact, well known to experienced soldiers that to stand firm but inactive under fire is a greater test than to assault against familiar fire. At this stage of the battle, action was only required of Clive's artillery, and they played their part effectively. The teams of oxen and elephants were soon thrown into confusion by the British guns, and many of the ponderous Indian pieces were knocked out by direct hits. It was far more difficult to silence the light guns manned by Frenchmen. So, of course, in this here, you actually have a small detachment of French in the Nawab's army as well, which again shows that there was a greater geopolitical involvement by proxy, French against the British in this, in this event here.
Also worth mentioning that the British infantry regiment at Plassey, there was only one British infantry battalion there, and that was the 39th Foot who later on became the Dorsetshire Regiment. And they were the guys who fought at Plassey.
Classic. Oh, interesting. And then you'd have your sepoys.
Yeah,
as well,
and then
yeah.
there were twice as many sepoys there as there were Brits. But of course, the Brits were still the core of the force, because if the Brits had been repelled at any stage, the sepoys would not have continued.
No. Right. We'll continue. It was far more difficult to silence the light guns manned by Frenchmen. These were brilliantly handled and did considerable execution before they could be neutralized. During this phase, Clive could identify the troops of Mir Jarif forming one flank to the Nawab's long line of battle. So far, there was no indication as to what part, if any, these troops and their command would play in the battle. However, unknown to Clive till later, his secret ally had already cooperated by sowing the seeds of defeat in the mind of Suraj Ut Dawal, aka the Nawab, who was fighting against the British. The Nawab, demoralized by the British bombardment, which had killed one of his most reliable generals, held a council of war in his tent. Miraj Jafar, perceiving that Sriracha had lost his nerve, recommended an imminent withdrawal to the entrenchments occupied during the previous night. Mohan Lal, another general, stoutly opposed this, knowing how quickly retreat could change to panic and rout in an army of that type and size. But Mir Jafar's advice prevailed, and the order for retreatment was given. Clive, quick to appreciate that moment for bold action had come. He ordered a general advance of his entire force, with the British 39th Regiment Foot leading, moved stealthily upon the centre of the immense overlapping line. This was the action which earned the 39th Foot, later the Dorsets, which the proud motto of Primus in Indus. As his 3,000 advanced, Clive anxiously watched the enemy flank where Mir Jafar's contingent was drawn up. Would they retreat with the rest? If not, how would Mir Jafar's react to the changing shape of the battle? For if the Mir's troops stood their ground, Clive's small army would soon be outflanked on that side and extremely vulnerable to a crushing pincer movement. But the troops on the flank stood still and gave no sign of their commander's intention. The fate of the battle and all its great political consequences hung upon the word of this temperamental conspirator, who had already given Clive reason to doubt his credibility. This does sound like a problem, mind you, because during this battle, there, Clive is obviously thinking to himself, "What's this Jafar character going to do? Is he going to side with me? Is he going to remain loyal to his Nawab? What's going to happen here?" And it kind of seems, in some ways, there is like at the time, we're looking not back at hindsight here, but at the time, it does seem like a really, really potentially reckless move by Clive.
Yeah. I mean, as the author just pointed out, if things had not turned out the way they did, and Clive had advanced with his relatively small army into the middle of this great Indian host with its French allies, he easily could have been surrounded and totally destroyed. You know, if things had gone differently, his whole army could have been destroyed.
Yes. No, and the
was,
conspirator.
he was tossing the coin in some ways. You know, he was staking everything on this.
But even still, though, the funny thing is that Jafar did seem quite loyal, probably because of personal gain for him, because he would then replace as the new Nawab. He was trying to subtly and very on a minimal level try and sabotage and in the word demoralize the Nawab's troops and other commanders and try and sow discontent in some
Oh
way.
yeah. And let's be clear about yes, absolutely. And let's be clear about this. This was the norm for Indian warfare of that era. This is not some innovation that Clive brought into India. This was the normal thing in Indian battles in those days. Is that they were very often turned by someone changing sides and this kind of stuff. Very, very common. And it was an Indian thing, not something that Clive had brought in.
Well,
Clive
no,
was merely adapting to Indian. Clive was merely adapting to Indian circumstances.
No, absolutely. But all went well. Jafar kept his word, at least up to a point. He did not, as he had promised to do, commit his troops to fight on the British side. Perhaps he felt that this would strain their loyalty to him too much. He simply held the inactive and neutral, held them inactive and neutral while Clive's counterattack passed by. The huge and menacing flank formation just watched while Clive and his troops entered the jaws of the pincers and completed the rout of the Nawab's main army. This great day, 23rd of June, 1757, may be counted as the foundation of British Empire in India. Thenceforth forward, though Jafar was nominally ruler of Bengal, the East India Company uh, called the tune. Matters by no means ran smoothly between the company and the puppet ruler, or with his successor, but slowly and surely British influence established itself firmly in Bengal, whence in course of time it spread northwestwards to the Khyber Pass, a long story which will be very briefly outlined in the next chapter. When once the French hopes of an Indian empire were defeated, it was only a matter of time before the remaining European power, the British, should become paramount throughout the subcontinent, annexing vast regions of it and allowing the surviving Indian states to exist only in a semi-independent format. So in some sort of funny way, the foundations of British imperial rule in India was thanks to this Jafar and this treacherous this treacherous um I guess you could say vassal of this Nawab and this overly corrupt and blackmailing merchant in Bengal. These two Indian.
Yeah, but also a really daring and successful attack, which the small British force made. I mean, without that attack, then obviously they still wouldn't have won the battle.
Yes,
and they did rout the Indian troops in front of them with no advantage in technology whatsoever. They had the same technology. The Indians had muskets. The Indians had the same sorts of artillery and actually more and bigger artillery than the British had. And without that really highly disciplined attack that routed the Indian forces in front of them, of course, all the diplomacy and dirty tricks of around diplomacy wouldn't have made any difference. If you couldn't have launched that attack, you would still have lost.
Yeah. But the purpose of this was effectively it all worked out well for Clive in the end. The merchant.
In the end, it did, but he was staking everything on it, because had the guy not at least kept his troops neutral, Clive's forces would have been crushed and all killed.
Yeah, so that's why I was saying Jafar was kind of the hero of the story in some ways.
In some ways, but of course he was doing it for his own benefit. And as I say, that was the normal way of Indian warfare in the mid-18th century. If two Indian forces were fighting each other in the mid-18th century, it was always that sort of thing which decided a battle, or almost always.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see if next time you have like some lefty or like some Hindu nationalists go off on one, just name drop Jafar into that, because that would like the greatest asset to British imperialism.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that was the normal way of Indian warfare. There were always constantly changing alliances between different factions, and there were so many factions. And I don't think we can emphasize this too much. There was no such thing as India in the mid-18th century. Like if you'd have spoken to one of the soldiers or even one of the officers of the guys on the Indian side at Plassey and said to them, "Oh, this, that, and the other about India," they would have just looked at you as if they thought you were mad. There was no such thing as India. Didn't exist. Even the concept of India didn't exist in the mid-18th century, like as a single nation.
There's parts of India or the Indian subcontinent we refer to today as India, which Indians then wouldn't have considered part of India.
Well, exactly. We ended up with Pakistan, and we ended up with East Pakistan. What was it? East Pakistan, West Pakistan? I can't remember now. West Pakistan.
Yeah, West Pakistan. Yeah.
Bangladesh, as it now is. But all those ended up separate. And there are still, particularly in the south of India and in the north of India, there are still groups who would really like independence. The Sikhs have talked about this. And look at Kashmir, which is very, very, very disputed territory between India and Pakistan. To say nothing of India's problems on the border with China, etc. So, even today, India is not truly united. But in the mid-18th century, there was no conception of India as a single place. It was a subcontinent of many, many, many states.
There's a province in India, I forget, it's out in the eastern part near not far from Bengal, actually. I think it's just to the east of Bengal, between that and Burma, and it's the population. It's about 3 million, 4 million. So it's relatively small, but it's this the ethnic group are more similar to the Burmese, I guess. They're more similar to the Burmese, but the population is like 100. Well, it's like 100% Presbyterian, right? It's like they are 100% Presbyterian. It's like it's technically it's one of the most Christian areas in India. But the interesting thing is, among the Indian population, and you look at the British company rule, there's no talk about like all they're doing is they're just having these local rulers, but you have like the overarching company, but there's no effort to like indoctrinate the Indian population in like parliamentarism or liberalism, like classical liberalism at the day, or Christianity or Protestantism. There's no direct.
No, that only began. That really only began in the middle of the 19th century, I would say, to some degree.
Yeah, and even the religious aspect was dropped because it was earlier on, because it was seen as
after the mutiny. After the mutiny, it was after the mutiny, it was almost totally dropped. Yes,
because it was just seen as counterproductive at that point. It wasn't drawing any benefits. And also there was you did have a Christian population in India from historical in the south, but also you have like this Anglo Indian, so people who were mixed race, I guess, which very, very, very small population, of course. I think the number was like from 20 to 50,000 during the Victorian era, late Victorian era.
I think it was a bit bigger than that by the end of the 19th century, but it still was, in terms of India, which of course is a very high population area, it was relatively small, yes. But it was, as you say, what they used to call Anglo-Indian, which meant they were mixed race people, Indian and British, yeah.
Yeah, and usually it'd be white fathers, Indian mothers. That's how it would usually be.
Yes.
Very rarely
Yeah,
the other way
absolutely.
around.
Many of them, very rarely. And they were related to people who worked on Indian railways, sometimes British Army soldiers who settled in India after their service. I'm talking about, privates and NCOs and what have you. And it was mainly that sort of thing, yeah.
Yes. Actually, I think that Scottish comedian, what's he called? Billy Connolly?
Mm-hmm.
He did like one of like Who Do You Think You Are? That like ancestry episodes that you have on. And he found his ancestor, obviously on his father's side, Scottish, but when he went back, it turns out his father had a relationship with an Indian woman during the mutiny. This was during the mutiny time, that is, and so he has like some Indian, DNA in there. So
yeah, it wasn't that uncommon for certainly British other rank soldiers to do that, because bear in mind that the British women who went to India tended to be middle and upper class ladies. And the regiments used to take a few wives with them, but not many. A regiment might take, I think it was about 24, 25 women with them, who were generally wives of NCOs, senior NCOs like sergeants and so on. But in general, lower class British women didn't settle in India. And so the other ranks didn't have a lot of choice, really, particularly in the 18th and the 19th century. Certainly right up until the end of the 19th century, a British regiment could spend a very long time in India. Like some regiments in the early 19th century spent 20 years there. Yeah. So if you were a British private or a British sergeant even, and you wanted to have some sort of relations with the opposite sex, you really didn't have a lot of choice in that regard.
yes, I mean it wasn't.
So I
As we
think
said, it wasn't.
yeah.
It wasn't anything crazy like the
And of
Spanish
course,
Empire.
officers used to. Yeah. No, it wasn't. But also, officers used to do that at some point. Like the recommended way, because all British officers in the Indian Army, and Indian Army officers, the Anglo-Indian Army officers, for the British Army in India, if you were an officer of a Sikh regiment or a Punjabi regiment or whatever it might be, you had to learn Urdu and whatever Indian language your troops spoke. And if you didn't, you'd get chucked out. You had to learn it. The recommended way of learning that was from an Indian mistress. It has to be said, it was. And in the 18th century and the early 19th century, it was fairly common for British officers to marry fairly high-born Indian ladies. So to give you a couple of examples, Skinner of Skinner's Horse, which became the Bengal Lancers, very, very famous Indian cavalry regiment, he was married to an Indian lady. Wheeler, whose force was destroyed by treachery during the Indian Mutiny at Cawnpore in 1857, General Wheeler was married to an Indian lady. But he was one of the last British officers who did marry Indians, because, as I say, he was killed in 1857 when his force was killed, largely by treachery, incidentally. But anyway, and he was quite elderly in 1857, but like he was married to an Indian lady. This was not unknown. It did happen. But as you say, it was invariably British men marrying Indian women.
Yes, no. It's quite funny because my grandfather learnt Urdu and Hindi and I don't think he learned it from like any Indian prostitute or anything. Well, I hope not. Um,
My grandfather served in India in between the wars, like in what was called the peacetime army, and he fought on the northwest frontier of India against a dude called the Fakir of Ipi, who was some sort of Muslim holy man. And he definitely knew some Urdu and Indian words, and he used to make enormously hot curries that my father, as a child, found far too hot.
Yeah.
But what he knew of Indian women, he never said, because blokes of that generation never talked about that sort of thing. So,
I say the only thing I know is my grandfather. He did get reprimanded by command in Shimla because when he was on R&R, he was like operating this side business of Persian rugs, believe it or not, through Afghanistan into India, and he was. I don't think it was only Persian rugs he was smuggling into country. Okay, so be that as what you may. But there was this one time that I've got this in his diary. There's like this letter that's like folded in there where it's from this Persian chap who's like getting really anxious about the rugs. Again, I don't think it's about rugs, but anyway, and he says we need to meet in uh, uh, Kandahar. We need to meet in Kandahar as soon as possible.
Southern Afghanistan, eh?
Yeah, and so they did. He traveled to Afghanistan. He then went over into Persia, and of course this was all around the same time you had the removal of the Shah there. When you had that whole business in that
Right,
region.
okay.
So that sort of coincided with everything that happened, and yeah, um, it was all over. It's a shame because I was too young at the time. It would have been interesting to ask him what was that all about. But it seems over the Persian rugs and everything, and it may have been over Persian rugs. I don't know. Maybe he was smuggling them into India. Apparently, though, there was like this accusation of there's one chap who was an Afghan who used to be our neighbor. When he saw the rugs, he said, "No, those are Afghan rugs. Those aren't Persian rugs." So maybe it was like
Perfectly possible, yeah. And
importing like Afghan rugs.
they're slightly less expensive, yeah.
Because he was selling them on to British families in India. He wasn't selling it on to like the Indian so maybe this was like a scam thing with like some Persian chap in Afghanistan.
Maybe he was selling Afghan rugs as Persian rugs and making an illicit profit. Yes, possibly. That's conceivable for sure.
No, my grandfather.
Have you finished the chapter?
Nearly. We've got like just a paragraph to go now. So yeah, we'll just finish the chapter.
I'm just thinking it's worth finishing the chapter for sure.
Yeah. So as far as concerned, the French in Bengal, the Plassey battle finished them. Clive demanded of his new protege, Jafar, that one of the first acts as Nawab should be the expulsion of the French from Chandragore, the only settlement in Bengal. It would undoubtedly have been done had not the Treaty of Paris in 1763 put an end to the 7 Years' War. Chandragore was one of the bargaining pawns of the peacemaking diplomats in Europe, and it was handed back to France as a measure of goodwill, being by only a decaying upriver suburb of Calcutta, quite incapable of harming or endangering British rule in Bengal. In the Deccan and Carnatic, the Anglo-French struggle continued for 3 years after Plassey, thanks to the ability of the Comte de Lally, who had succeeded Dupleix. But in 1760, he met his match at Wandwash at the hands of Sir Eyre Coote, a distinguished
So
Irish
Erie
soldier
Coote. Yes.
who distinguished Irish soldier who had served under Clive at Plassey. The following year, Sir Eyre captured Pondicherry and gave the coup de grace to French hopes of empire. During subsequent wars, France renewed her efforts to gain a footing in southern India by supporting Hyder Ali, the dictator of Mysore, which we mentioned on our other stream, and later his son,
Tipu Sahib.
Tipper Sultan, in their wars against the British. For Clive's victory at Plassey, though it opened a path up the Ganges valleys towards Delhi, still left three formidable Indian powers in the subcontinent in southern India: Mysore, the Deccan, and warlike Hindu confederation, the Maharajas. I think he's referring to the Martha Confederacy, as we would call them today. All
Yes,
these native
they're the guys who Wellington destroyed in India.
Yes, and they were not by any means like a pushover, or these were unlike the others. These
No,
were
not at
Hindu.
all. Not at all.
No, these were. I mean, they had proper European style tactics, training, armaments. These were not some backward Islamic Turkic warrior caste of people. These were very highly capable, and also had deep. I mean, they had.
All of the people, all of the people, AI, all of the people you spoke of, like Tipu Sahib in Mysore, the Maharatha Confederacy, etc. All of these people had equivalent weapons to the British in terms of smoothbore flintlock muskets, and probably more and better artillery than the British had. And
I
all
would
of
say.
them had European training as well.
I would say IronDuke, though, on the point of the Mysore, what made that case different to the Martha Confederacy, which I think was a greater challenge for the British, was the Mysore state. While if you ever people watching this look on the map of the Mysore state, it's right in the southern part of India. It's bordering the Tamil territories in southern India, huge area, but the ruler was an Islamic. It was an Islamic sultanate,
Yes,
right? But the population
yes.
was overwhelmingly Hindu. I mean, the Muslim population was such a small percentage that
Oh yeah, no, it
as
was very
Welling
much a bit like the Brits in India. Yeah,
and as
level
we
of
found out in our,
society which was quite small, controlling a Hindu much bigger population. Yeah,
yeah, so that
but
when
also, of
Wellesley.
course, Tipu Sultan and his father got lots of support from the French as well.
Yeah, which bolstered them up. But as I was saying, is in the previous stream we sort of found out that the population, the native population, were largely indifferent because of that factor, because they just saw two rival powers fighting it out. There was just largely indifferent over the Sultanate, compared to the Martha
But it had always
Confederacy, where there
been
was.
that way in India, But AI
Hmm.
had always been that way in India, that you would have the vast mass of the population. I mean, there was no kind of democracy or what have you in India. You had the ruling classes, and they would just co-opt the local people, whatever their religion was, into their assorted dynastic wars. I mean, this had always happened in India.
Yeah. I mean, for the average Indian, like the average Indian peasant or what have you, the reality of their sort of their idea of a community wasn't, as I said, wasn't founded in in a nation state. It was in their village. So anything beyond their village was, might as well
No,
be like an alien world to them.
yeah. Absolutely. And part of the reason the British gradually became very popular with the Indian peasants was that, unlike almost all their others, the British were at least fair, and they had a reasonable legal system where a peasant could go to court and possibly win against his landlord, you know. And British taxes were not particularly high. And Britain didn't tend to send people to go and beat up the local peasants to get twice as much tax this year because they wanted it, you know. And so gradually Britain became more popular just because the British system was fairer to these peasants, you know.
Yeah. The other interesting thing that is mentioned here is, of course, the British effort to stamp out and you see this regularly brought up by, I guess, people on the British side online, is the wife burnings, certain Hindu practices and
Yeah,
stuff.
sati, which was sati, which was Hindu wife burning. That was absolutely wiped out by the British, nobody else. And also the Thuggee cult, which for hundreds and hundreds of years had killed thousands of Indians while they were traveling on the roads, you know, when they went to visit their families or for religious festivals. The Thuggee cult, which was a mixture of religion for the goddess Kali, which is a Hindu goddess, and basically just banditry, because they made money, obviously, when they slaughtered these caravans of Indians. Sati, the Hindu widow burning, and Thuggee, which was the cult of Kali, the goddess, killing Indians who were traveling on the roads, including many women and children, by the way. Both of those were stamped out by the British and nobody else.
No, definitely. Yeah, and again, you know, a lot of lefties would always draw to that and say, "Oh, look at the violence British inflicted here," and it's like, well, let's look at the people that we were inflicting it on. You know, it was not without reason. And I would say actually,
Yeah,
there's a good film with
absolutely.
Piers. There's a
There's a not bad movie called The Deceivers that you
with
can
Piers
find
Brosnan. Yeah, Piers
with Pierce
Brosnan.
Brosnan, who used to play 007, although he's an American, not British. But anyway, but he does a reasonable British accent. But
Isn't he
he
Irish? Hold on, Iron Duke. Hold on, Iron Duke. He's
yeah, I'm
Irish, isn't
sorry. I
he?
think he might have been Irish. That's right. But he lived in America for a very long time. But anyway, yeah, there's a movie called The Deceivers, and it's based on a novel written by a British Indian Army officer called John Masters. And John Masters joined an Indian regiment of the British Indian Army, like in the 1930s. I think his first biography is called Bugles and the Tiger. And it talks about when he first joined his regiment in the 1930s and learning Urdu and all this kind of stuff. In fact, he joined a Gurkha regiment, if I remember correctly. And he was also a Chindit, the guys who fought behind Japanese lines in World War II. He became one of those guys. And the Deceivers is one of his novels. But it's based on the true story of the British officer who on his own initially discovered about the Thuggee cult and then got the British authorities to wipe it out, which to the immense benefit of ordinary Indians, of course.
Yes. So I'm just going to finish this chapter because there's only a sentence left. There's only like
No worries, man.
so yeah, the following year, Sir E captured Pondicherry and gave the coup de grace to the French hopes of the empire. During subsequent wars, France renewed their efforts to gain a footing in southern India by supporting Hyder Ali, dictator of Mysore, and later his son Tipu Sultan, in their wars against the British. For Clive's victory at Plassey, though it opened a path up for the Ganges valleys towards Delhi, still left 3 formidable Indian provinces and subdued the southern Indian Mysore, the Deccan, and the warlike Hindu Confederation, the Martha Confederacy. All these native wars and the part played in them by the French fall more appropriately into the next step of the chapter, which would go on into the build-up of Napoleonic conflicts, of course, with Arthur Wellesley and his successors in India as well, and sort of cementing British control over. I have got a book here, IronDuke, of what is it? It's a Sharp novel when he was in India.
Oh yeah. There was a couple that I set there largely. Yes, indeed.
I think it's Sharp's Peril or something like that.
I can't remember, mate. I've read all of them at least once, but yeah, they have their inaccuracies, but in general, he's not too bad on history.
No, I mean the latest one where it's like Sharp spy in Paris. I haven't read that one. It's more like Sharp
No, I
becomes
don't
a
know
bit
that
like
one.
it becomes like he's like double. He's like I think Sharp and Harper become like 007 spies in Paris for.
Yeah, I
Uh,
haven't heard that one.
yeah,
The only one I really dislike is Sharp's Trafalgar, because the author doesn't know bugger all about the sailing Royal Navy. But anyway, that's the only one
yeah,
I
I've heard.
really dislike.
Yeah, I've heard that one's like it's got quite bad reviews, and for that one, I mean also the Last
He just
Kingdom,
doesn't
which is
understand the Nelson era Navy, you know.
I would say it's Bernard Cornwell, isn't it? The author. That's the author of the Sharp
Yeah,
novels. I,
that's right. Yeah.
I would say his the Last Kingdom is not that great. I've read it. It's not that great, if I'm absolutely honest. I think
The
he gets
books are
the character.
better than the TV show. The books are better than the TV show, I will say that.
Yeah, the only thing is I think he gets Alfred and Asa's relationship a bit wrong, but in some ways
Sure.
that's the only thing that get in the book. That is, I mean, they were close, but their closeness was sort of after the sacking of Chichester. That's when they sort of became a bit closer than
I
before.
just can't get over the Saxons in the TV show having these Roman type shields rather than the round ones they really used. And it was plainly just done so that idiot audiences who knew nothing about history could tell who was who. You know, it was like, you know.
Well, the Vikings had like elvish armor. I mean, that was like they had like glass and elvish armor. I mean, it's mental. It's like
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
like
yeah.
I think one of like there was like some Viking on horseback had a 16th century helmet on. It's like
Yeah, it
yeah,
doesn't surprise me. And there's far too many cavalry in all those, in all the TV series. You know, the Brits didn't really, the Anglo-Saxons didn't really use cavalry much.
no, it was the Normans. It
Guys
was the
would
Normans.
sometimes use, yeah, but they would sometimes use horses to get where they were going, but then they'd fight on foot. And likewise, the Vikings didn't bring horses with them. They might steal a few, you know, for like guys to act as recce units and stuff like that. But basically, they fought on foot too. And it's funny because if you go into the High Middle Ages with the English in the 100 Years' War, the English were well known that they mostly fought on foot. Even then, you know, they didn't use cavalry much. They did occasionally, but not all that often.
No. I mean, it was sort of the Normans that
The British
cultivated.
armor, English armor, was even designed for fighting on foot.
Yeah, I mean, you actually the funny thing is,
But
how
over time, after 1066, they actually, even the Normans kind of were they kind of went along with the English cultural thing of fighting on foot, so that in the 100 Years' War, the English armies almost invariably, mostly, fought on foot. They didn't fight on horseback.
No, I mean the interesting
I'm
thing
not
is,
saying the British. I'm not saying the English never used mounted knights, because they did, but for the most part, English soldiers in the 100 Years' War fought on foot.
no, I mean yeah, that's right. And the interesting thing is, what was it? Uh, Edward the Confessor. A great deal of his forces were actually invested in his navy, in his
Yes.
naval force. Which and same with
There
Harold
there are
Godwinson.
people. There are people who argue that the Royal Navy can trace its ancestry back to Alfred. There are people
Yeah,
who argue that.
and it makes sense because of course a lot of the invaders were coming in via the Vikings via ships, and this was one of the reasons why, because William
Yes.
the Conqueror, he some of his like even family members were advising him not to launch the invasion, the sea invasion, because if they were caught in the Channel by Saxon ships, this would be this would
Yeah.
be detrimental. Of course, though, he didn't need to worry because Harald Hardrada from Norway sort of um, drew all that attention towards
Completely
him, and so
distracted Harold, the English king. Yes.
yeah, he distracted him, which was a massive help for William. I mean that was a godsend really for him. It was
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, Harold, the English king, destroyed Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, totally destroyed him. And had all those forces been available at Hastings, very difficult to see how William the Bastard could have won. Very difficult.
yeah,
Like
and
if
the Saxon
Harold's army hadn't have fought at Stamford Bridge first, and all of those forces had been available at Hastings, I don't think William the Bastard would have won at all, to be honest.
no,
And
and bearing in
all of
mind
history would have been changed.
it would have been, but the thing is that the Saxons at Hastings did have the control of the hill at the higher ground, which
Oh yeah,
is
look, they only won because William the Bastard was able to fake a retreat and make some of the less disciplined Saxon Freed chase his soldiers down the hill and abandon their position. Had that not happened, until that time, the Saxons were easily holding their own.
I know. I it's interesting because I mean that was that I mean you well. Do you think that was an order given, or do you think it was just pure excitement by the
No,
Saxon men at
I
the
think
time?
they were part-time soldiers, like the English housecarls, the king's household troops, who were the professional warriors. They didn't run down the hill. It was the part-time freed guys who lost their discipline, and because they thought the Normans were running away, chased down the hill. And of course, at that stage, the Norman cavalry were able to get behind them, and when they were out of formation, and just fucking kill them. Excuse my language.
Yeah, no, that's right.
I think it was just indiscipline, to be honest.
I mean, that's a terrible way to go.
But excuse my language, I shouldn't swear. But I was a soldier, and we do tend to swear a bit. So
Yeah, I was interested by your stream with Morgoth on the film Zulu, how there was that what was it? He was like a was it there was that character who was going round not in the film but you were saying in real life, who was reminding soldiers not to swear in the heat of battle.
oh yeah, Reverend Smith. He was known as Ammunition Smith because he wasn't shown in the movie at all, but he was a real guy at the battle. You can see him in one or two of the paintings of the battle made at the time. and he went round through the whole battle, passing out ammunition to the soldiers and trying to tell them not to swear. And I can assure you that's an uphill battle with British Army soldiers. I don't think he was winning that one, he was a volunteer chaplain, and because of his service at Rorke's Drift, the Army Chaplains Department gave him a commission, so he became an official British Army chaplain after that. But for some reason, the movie chose not to put him in the film at all. So there we go.
I think that would have been entertaining for like a chaplain who was just going around and saying, "You remember, lads, no swearing, no swearing. I do not want to
and
hear foul language."
He would have also been the total opposite of Wit, in that he was not a coward at all. He was a very brave man, and he was continually circling the defenses for 12 hours, passing out ammo and stuff, and occasionally helping Surgeon Reynolds with the wounded. He was a good guy.
I mean, he would have. Wit. By the way, I just have a question on that. The missionary Wit in that. Was he as cowardly and depicted in the film as he was in real life? Like, did he actually have like full-on breakdown?
Well, look, in reality, he left before the fighting started. Yeah, he left very early on, and his wife and daughter had left even earlier than that. And what actually happened was, while he was on the road in his buggy, trying to get to civilization, so he would have been going for Greytown and then Pietermaritzburg and then Durban. Somewhere on that road, people told him the Zulus had killed his wife and daughter, which was not true at all, because they left even earlier than he did. And some people told his wife and daughter he got killed, which was also not true. But then Wit went to England afterwards, and then had a period when he was giving lectures in various halls for money, obviously, claiming to have been Isan Luana and Rorke's Drift. And he wasn't either of them, actually. But he made some money out of it for a while.
Yeah.
And Rorke's Drift is still a Swedish mission station today. They still own it.
Oh, interesting. It's interesting. Because it then begs the question: why did the film directors portray the clergyman in that as like a bit of a coward and a drunk? That's interesting. That
I have no idea, mate. Look, the main people who made it were Cy Amfield, who was the director. And Cy Amfield was one of those American movie directors who was thrown out of Hollywood during the McCarthy trials.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was an extreme lefty, in other words, let us say.
Do I also need to do an early life check on him?
John... No, I'm not sure about that, mate. You can. I don't know. I've never done it, but maybe, yeah, possible. But he was certainly a lefty, because he had to leave America during the McCarthy trials, like other people, like Sam Wanamaker, for example. Same thing. They went to England.
IronDuke, hold on.
Then you have...
Sorry, hold on. I have just done an early life check on him, and his parents were from Eastern Europe. Went to New York.
Well, there you
grew
go.
up in Pennsylvania.
What a surprise.
So, and he is of that group. So, once again, my Jedi instincts on the matter has been.
Well, maybe that has something to do with his. Maybe that has something to do with the anti-Christianity thing, and why they didn't put Ammunition Smith in there, who was a good Christian dude. But
yes.
Hang on. Also, the other thing is the screenwriter for Zulu was a guy called John Preble, and John Preble was an Englishman, although he lived in Canada for a while, but he was born in England, who is mainly well known for writing very anti-English histories of Scotland. In fact, for a long time, I thought he was Scottish. He's not. He's English. But he's English. He lived in Canada for quite a while, but he was born in England. And he was, prior to World War II, an actual member of the Communist Party. And John Preble left the Communist Party, he said, during World War II. So by the time of 1964 came around and he wrote Zulu, he wasn't any longer a communist, but I think it's fair to say he's a lefty by all means. And of course, the other person who made Zulu, because he was the executive producer, is the Welsh actor Stanley Baker, who played Chard in the movie. And Stanley Baker's main interest was to make it a Welsh nationalist thing, which is why they pretend that they were the South Wales Borderers, which they weren't in 1879. You know, they were the Warwickshire Regiment. They only became the South Wales Borderers in 1881. But that's why you get Men of Harlech and all this stuff in it.
Yeah, I would say the writer, because I'm aware of the screenwriter John Preble, because he also wrote.
Well, his most famous book is Culloden, but he's also done books about the Highland clearances and all sorts of other stuff.
Well, I was going to say Culloden one because it was a BBC documentary. It was a docudrama, but for the BBC, Culloden. And again, that one is very, very historically inaccurate. I mean, it is incredibly historically inaccurate on all occasions.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been to Culloden in Scotland. I've been to the battlefield, and yeah, it is not very accurate. You're quite right.
Yeah, because he makes it sound like it was a full-on English, a form of he's framed in as you said, like in a nationalistic sense of the Imperial English against the poor, impoverished Scottish clans culture, and in reality,
whereas in fact half the English in air quotes army was Lowland Scots. You know.
Yeah, it was like Duncan Forbes, wasn't it, and George Wade and the Duke of Cumberland and stuff, and and also there were English people in the Jacobite movement. I mean, people forget that there were British Jacobites,
people who still supported the king over the water. Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah,
absolutely right. I think we're wandering a long way from your stream, but yeah. But no, absolutely. The guys who made Zulu were the two main guys, Cy Enfield and John Preble, were very much lefties. That's a fact.
You see that there was always something. I rewatched Zulu after your stream.
I mean, I think that's even why they made Henry Hook this barrack room lawyer bloke, when the real Henry Hook was actually a very good soldier who was still serving in the British Army in 1905. The only reason Henry Hook was in the hospital was he'd been detailed by an NCO, presumably, to make tea for the sick guys in the hospital. That was the only reason he was there. He wasn't malingering and pretending to be sick. He'd been detailed to make tea for the sick guys.
That's really fucked up that they've like tarnished his legacy.
As I said on the Morgoth stream, I think I did anyway. I meant to. His two surviving granddaughters, who were elderly in the 1960s, of course, both stormed out of the premiere of the movie because they hated the way their grandfather had been shown in the film, because he wasn't like that at all. Henry Hook. He was quite badly wounded at Rorke's Drift. He got an assegai that penetrated his helmet like a spear, that penetrated his helmet and actually went quite deeply into his scalp. In fact, if you see later photographs of him, he's got what looks like a very wide parting, which is actually where this spear had gone through and half scalped him. Yeah. So he wasn't all totally fit after Rorke's Drift in 1879, but he stayed in the British forces, latterly in the reserve forces, until 1905, which is about when he died. He was a British soldier almost to the day he died.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at all the photos of him in his later life,
You can
and in
see
every
that big
photo,
wide center parting thing he's got.
yeah,
That's not a parting. That's where the spear went into his scalp and badly wounded him.
oh Jesus Christ! I'm looking at a bit of a clearer photo
The
here with a
only
different
bit that's
contrast.
accurate in Zulu about the only bit in Zulu which is accurate about Henry Hook is the fighting that he does in the hospital. He really was that brave and really did fight that many guys on his own. But he was actually a good soldier. He was not some sort of barrack room lawyer and all this kind of stuff.
There's a book here by Barry Johnson about Hook and of Rorke's Drift and the life of Henry Hook, VC.
Mm-hmm.
Wonder if that looks quite.
Yeah, I haven't read that, but it would probably be good.
There's a bit the front cover shows him carrying wounded out of the hospital, presumably when it was attacked by the Zulus.
Yes.
Yeah,
they did that
carrying...
under fire, and also the Zulus. The Zulus were also leaping over the low barriers on both sides to try and assegai the blokes, to spear the blokes who were trying to crawl or be carried to the new British entrenchment. So that was very dangerous what he was doing there. But no, Henry Hook was a really good British soldier. And as I say, his two elderly granddaughters, who were still around in 1964, both walked out of the premiere in the middle of it because of the way he'd been shown in the film.
No, definitely.
But he was nothing like that at all. He was a good soldier, and some sergeant had said to him, "Right, Hook, you're going to make tea for the sick in the hospital," and that's what he did. So when the hospital, when the Rorke's Drift was besieged, naturally enough, Hook took up his post in the hospital, where he helped many of the wounded to escape being killed.
No, definitely, and he's
true story.
There's even a poem about him in 1899 by William McDonagall. Yeah, it's quite an interesting one.
Yeah, he's quite infamous. McGonagall's quite infamous, but yes.
Yeah.
he did lots of doggerel about the British Army and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because his Alfred Henry Hook is his full title, title B, or Henry, or just Henry Hook. I mean, every picture, especially of his later life, he is wearing, completely opposite from the character in the film. He's wearing his badges. His uniform is neat and tidy. I mean, he looks at all like the a soldier would be like, and
he's also got the big typical Victorian soldier's moustache and all that. Yes.
Oh yeah, big moustache.
Yeah. No. Hook was a good soldier, and like I say, they did not portray him accurately in the film, except how brave he was in the fighting in the hospital. That was true, but nothing else.
Yeah, but then, like, even during that hospital fight, he sort of lets himself. In the film, he ends up stopping, taking like a bit of brandy, and then swigging it defiantly.
Yep.
So even then, it's sort of undermined.
But again, I think you're seeing the lefty biases of the people who made the film coming through there, because you have to have this working class rebel guy. You understand? So, rather than being a good patriotic British soldier, which he was really. So,
Yes. Oh dear, I think McCarthy and a few other people in the 20th century were right. If I'm absolutely honest.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I think McCarthy was much more right than wrong for sure, 100%. Anyway, thank you very much, AI, for inviting
No,
me on your stream. I'm
no,
always
definitely.
happy to come on these streams because I like that book. It's really good. So yeah, if you ever want another guest, just ask and I'll happily turn up again.
It's funny because the copy of the book that I've got online, I'm just looking through it now because I got a PDF. Whoever copied this book onto PDF, obviously it was used in some other way because there's like side notes and stuff people have got on here and like highlighted sections. Um, obviously the ones they're looking at is the Cape
I'll try and
Colony.
find. I've got a copy of that. I've got a copy of that AI, and I'll send you my copy. You can see if it's better.
Yeah, because I think the reason why I was sort of
Like I've got another PDF copy of that.
yeah, the reason I was pausing so much is the part of the left side of the page had been smudged, so it was quite difficult to,
Okay.
to
Well,
interpret what was.
I'm going to go to sleep now, but when I wake up, I'll send you my PDF copy of it, and if it's better, you can use that one. So
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I need to get off to bed as
anyway,
well. It's nearly midnight here.
thank you very much for coming on. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
thank
could
you
I
for.
just say, please come and check us out for Splendid Isolation, 9 p.m. on Saturday, UK time.
No, absolutely. Yeah, spend isolation on Saturday. Thank you, IronDuke, for coming on, and we will see you all next time when we cover the consolidation of British rule in Canada and India. Until then, good night, everyone.